aged Queen. Her smile, once so rare a visitant to those saddened features, flitted over them with an easy alacrity; the blue eyes beamed; the whole face, starting suddenly from its pendulous expressionlessness, brightened and softened, and cast over those who watched it an unforgettable charm. For in her last years there was a fascination in Victoria's amiability which had been lacking even from the vivid impulse of her youth. Over all who approached her, or very nearly all, she threw a peculiar spell. Her grandchildren adored her; her ladies waited upon her with a reverential love. The honour of serving her obliterated 1,000 inconveniences: the monotony of a court existence, the fatigue of standing, the necessity for a superhuman attentiveness to the minutiae of time and space. As one did one's wonderful duty, one could forget that one's legs were aching from the infinitude of the passages at Windsor, or that one's bare arms were turning blue in the Balmoral cold. What, above all, seemed to make such service delightful was the detailed interest which the Queen took in the circumstances of those around her. Her absorbing passion for the comfortable commonplaces, the small crises, the recurrent sentimentalities of domestic life, constantly demanded wider fields for its activity. The sphere of her own family, vast as it was not enough. She became the eager confidante of the household affairs of her ladies. Her sympathies reached out to the palace domestics. Even the housemaids and scullions, so it appeared, were the objects of her searching inquiries, and of her heartfelt solicitude when their lovers were ordered to a foreign station, or their aunts suffered from an attack of rheumatism which was more than usually acute. Nevertheless, the due distinctions of rank were immaculately preserved. The Queen's mere presence was enough to ensure that, but in addition the dominion of court etiquette was paramount. For that elaborate code, which had kept Lord Melbourne stiff upon the sofa and ranged the other guests in silence about the round table according to the order of precedence, was as punctiliously enforced as ever. Every evening after dinner, the hearthrug, sacred to royalty, loomed before the profane in inaccessible glory, or, on one or two terrific occasions, actually lured them magnetically forward to the very edge of the abyss. The Queen, at the fitting moment, moved towards her guests. One after the other they were led up to her, and while dialogue followed dialogue in constraint and embarrassment, the rest of the assembly stood still without a word. Only in one particular was the severity of the etiquette allowed to lapse. Throughout the greater part of the reign, the rule that Ministers must stand during their audiences with the Queen had been absolute. When Lord Derby, the Prime Minister, had an audience of Her Majesty after a serious illness, he mentioned it afterwards, as a proof of the royal favour, that the Queen had remarked "how sorry she was she could not ask him to be seated." Subsequently, Disraeli, after an attack of gout and in a moment of extreme expansion on the part of Victoria, had been offered a chair, but he had thought it wise humbly to decline the privilege. In her later years, however, the Queen invariably asked Mr. Gladstone and Lord Salisbury to sit down. Sometimes the solemnity of the evening was diversified by a concert, an opera, or even a play. One of the most marked indications of Victoria's enfranchisement from the thraldom of widowhood had been her resumption, after an interval of 30 years, of the custom of commanding dramatic companies from London to perform before the court at Windsor. On such occasions her spirits rose high. She loved acting, she loved a good plot; above all, she loved a farce. Engrossed by everything that passed upon the stage, she would follow with childlike innocence the unwinding of the story; or she would assume an air of knowing superiority and exclaim in triumph, "There! You didn't expect that, did you?" when the denouement came. Her sense of humour was of a vigorous, though primitive, kind. She had been one of the very few persons who had always been able to appreciate the Prince Consort's jokes; and when those were cracked no more, she could still roar with laughter in the privacy of her household over some small piece of fun. some oddity of an ambassador, or some ignorant minister's faux pas. When the jest grew subtle, she was less pleased; but if it approached the confines of the indecorous, the danger was serious. To take a liberty called down at once Her Majesty's most crushing disapprobation, and to say something improper was to take the greatest liberty of all. Then the royal lips sank down at the corners, the royal eyes stared in astonished protrusion, and, in fact, the royal countenance became inauspicious in the highest degree. The transgressors shuddered into silence, while the awful "We are not amused" annihilated the dinner table. Afterwards, in her private entourage, the Queen would observe that the person in question was, she very much feared, "not discreet." It was a verdict from which there was no appeal. In general, her aesthetic tastes had remained unchanged since the days of Mendelssohn, Landseer and Lablache. She still delighted in the roulade of Italian opera; she still demanded a high standard in the execution of a pianoforte duet. Her views on painting were decided. Sir Edwin, she declared, was perfect; she was much impressed by Lord Leighton's manners; and she profoundly distrusted Mr. Watts. From time to time she ordered engraved portraits to be taken of members of the royal family. On these occasions she would have the first proofs submitted to her, and, having inspected them with minute particularity, she would point out their mistakes to the artists, indicating at the same time how they might be corrected. The artists invariably discovered that Her Majesty's suggestions were of the highest value. In literature her interests were more restricted. She was devoted to Lord Tennyson, and, as the Prince Consort had admired George Eliot, she perused Middlemarch. She was disappointed. There is reason to believe, however, that the romances of another female writer, whose popularity among the humbler classes of Her Majesty's subjects was at one time enormous, secured no less the approval of Her Majesty. Otherwise she did not read very much. Once, however, the Queen's attention was drawn to a publication which it was impossible for her to ignore. The Greville Memoirs, filled with a mass of historical information of extraordinary importance, but filled also with descriptions, which were by no means flattering, of George IV, William IV and other royal persons, was brought out by Mr. Reeve. Victoria read the book and was appalled. It was, she declared, "a dreadful and really scandalous book," and she could not say how horrified and indignant she was at Greville's indiscretion, indelicacy, ingratitude towards friends, betrayal of confidence, and shameful disloyalty towards his sovereign. She wrote to Disraeli to tell him that, in her opinion, it was very important that the book should be severely censured and discredited. "The tone in which he speaks of royalty," she added, "is unlike anything one sees in history even, and is most reprehensible." Her anger was directed with almost equal vehemence against Mr. Reeve for his having published "such an abominable book," and she charged Sir Arthur Helps to convey to him her deep displeasure. Mr. Reeve, however, was impenitent. When Sir Arthur told him that, in the Queen's opinion, "the book degraded royalty," he replied, "Not at all. It elevates it by the contrast it offers between the present and the defunct state of affairs." But this adroit defence failed to make any impression upon Victoria, and Mr. Reeve, when he retired from the public service, did not receive the knighthood which custom entitled him to expect. Perhaps if the Queen had known how many caustic comments upon herself Mr. Reeve had quietly suppressed in the published memoirs, she would have been almost grateful to him. But in that case, what would she have said of Greville? Imagination boggles at the thought. As for more modern essays upon the same topic, Her Majesty, it is to be feared, would have characterised them as "not discreet." But, as a rule, the leisure hours of that active life were occupied with recreations of a less intangible quality.